Our next presenter injured her foot a few days ago and still drove all the way out here from Chicago to be here. So let's welcome Alexandra Falindra from the University of Illinois, Chicago.
I don't need that. I have my own. Thank you. So I guess before I start, I will read you a letter from 10-year-old Dylan. We're not doing that? I'm sorry. I thought that it was a thing now. Pickle. Yes, pickle. So this is a new project that I am working on that, not surprisingly, sort of sprang out of the horrific 2016 election year, and which is kind of continuing. It doesn't end. I have been working on issues of prejudice for a while now, mostly as it relates to policy. But something about the 2016 electoral cycle made me think about these particular questions. So are the effects of messaging, racialized messaging, racist messaging, the same regardless of the race of the candidate? You probably have some idea where this is coming from. Does minority status provide moral license to endorse prejudice? And I'll talk more about what moral license is all about. Also, can we actually soften the response, the negative response to racist messaging by creating a way for people to psychologically accept it and endorse it? Are there ways to do that? And is this anti-PC message that's coming out from the right, this very, very strong presentation of, all kinds of things presented as about political correctness, a way to license people, white Americans, to endorse things that 30 or 40 years ago would be viewed as unacceptable, as prescribed by the culture. Also, finally, and I'm probably not going to have enough time to get to this, but it's really interesting. Does prejudice have a party? Do people associate the race of the candidate or the content of a message with a specific party? And this ties into recent research that Nick Valentino here is doing on affective partisanship and the role of racial identities, and Liliana Mason also is doing this kind of, and pretty much what Mara was sort of hinting at in some ways. So why should we care about any of these things, right? Well, the 2016 election has something to do with this. But in terms of more from political science perspective, and also as human beings as normative perspective, there's a huge problem with the idea that egalitarian norms may not be as strong as we assume them to be. That as Roger Smith and Desmond King have argued, their cycles and norms can change. And we're not in this sort of linear trajectory to some kind of heaven in terms of how we deal with issues of race and ethnicity, but actually we're backtracking, and there's a backlash. From a theoretical perspective, as political scientists, it's important to know and figure out whether norms are context dependent and what is that context that drives people to sort of accept different norms and change their norms. And we already know, and we have seen some research raising alarm that prejudice may be coming back in pretty alarming forms, like Spencer was talking about yesterday. And we need to know about whether this is something that can stay because there's some change in the political environment in terms of how people internalize norms. Of course, all of this has incredible implications for how democracy functions in a diverse society like the American society. But really, my ultimate motivation from this came out of watching the 2016 election and completely freaking out on Facebook about what was happening on a daily basis. So what happened, like, during the election? Well, here's Donald Trump talking about outgroups. Donald Trump wasn't particularly charitable in the way he expressed himself about other groups. In addition, you know, that Mexican killers will throw first a 60-pound bag over your head over the border wall and then rape you, apparently. Violence, blacks are violent. And also he often talked about how it's politically correct people who sort of prevent us from telling the truth and being honest. In this case, about the Muslims who celebrated in New Jersey the falling of the towers, the attack against New York, but he's used this frame of political correctness on a number of occasions. So this is Donald Trump, but this is Ben Carson. Ben Carson talking about how black-on-black violent crime is an indication of significant deterioration of political values. He actually, in the longer form of this text, said that you know, if all black men had his mother, they would be decent human beings and decent people, but they're not. He also brought up political correctness, that apparently Obamacare, if we were true and not politically correct and we didn't fall in the trap, we'd know that Obamacare is worse than slavery, or worse since slavery. He also compared, he actually said that slavery was immigration, which was another, that was more recent, it wasn't during the campaign. So he has also used rhetoric that is quite derogatory to his own racial group, his own in-group. And he's not the only one. Here's Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz telling us that aliens are illegally re-entering the country and illegally returning, and they're illegal, and they're going to commit murder. And also talking about blacks and Black Lives Matter. He's saying that the best way to protect black lives is to keep them safe from murderers, sort of alluding that within the black community there is incredible violence, and basically blacks are violent. And he also used in a lot of his statements this whole frame of political correctness, saying that Barack Obama, by being politically correct, he doesn't attribute terrorism to Islam, to radical Islam, and that is a threat to our security. So we are seeing essentially this type of typology. I've been trying to sort of put it together. We see what we've known in the literature as overt white on other racial messaging, which we have studied because has been around for a long time. But we also see this overt but sort of couched as resistance to political correctness, that I'm being honest and I'm telling the truth and I'm not being politically correct and sort of a snowflake. But we also see more and more, especially within the Republican Party, overt minority in-group directed messaging. So derogatory and quite strong derogatory language from minorities directed at their own in-group. And also the same thing intra-minority, minorities on other minorities. This is an interesting development, and in part it is because we have minority candidates arising to the national stage on the right and on the left, obviously, but this is something that has been happening more so on the right. So what do we know about this? Well, turns out not very much. It's really not something that we have studied a lot about. We know from the literature on white racist messaging that white candidates who are explicitly and overtly racist against African Americans tend to be punished at the polls because after the civil rights movement, goes the theory, racial egalitarian norms became the dominant norms of the land. And as a result, white people recognize that calling African Americans criminal or saying really negative things overtly about them is something that is a no-no and you can't support it. So there's research that says that subtle messaging is what works. You need to be, not as direct and to the point. We also know that from studies about the race of the candidate, that the race of the candidate may or may not matter in the political behavior and choices of white voters. Some studies have shown effects of the race of the candidate independent of what they're saying, and other studies say not so much. So that's about what we have. But what about how whites evaluate minority candidates who derogate the in-group, or about this anti-PC thing? Well, there is a study by Berinsky from 2011 that talks about how minority politicians may be punished more severely for norms violations. But in that case, it's about sexual propriety, because what Berinsky is doing is asking whether, how would you evaluate a sex scandal by Obama versus a white candidate? And that is a different dimension. It's not the same thing. But this suggests that if white people perceive this as derogation, if they do perceive negative speech as derogation, then they should punish African Americans who derogate their in-group. This is a big if, and here's why it is a big if. In moral psychology and in social identity theory, there are theories of what's known as moral or psychological license, which basically talks about the ways and mechanism to give permission to people to express feelings that society doesn't generally sanction. So how can I basically give you a way to express those latent feelings that you know that is not societally acceptable to express? And we know, for example, that if you give race-neutral ways to people to express racism, from studies of aversive racism and others, they're more likely to actually express these latent feelings. And other studies have also shown that in-group members have moral standing or license to be critical and quite negative and derogatory of their own groups. So maybe that's another way, by basically saying that I am describing my own group and I'm talking about my own group, the observer has the perception that you have the right to do that because it is your own group. Studies also show that outsiders look at group members as experts. I'm from Greece, so people come to me and ask me about Greece and ask me about Greeks. So when I say negative things about Greece, people sort of assume that I have the right to do so. And people look at members of a group to evaluate and judge whether a response is acceptable. So if somebody says something negative about Greeks, they may look at me to sort of determine whether this is an okay thing and they can endorse it or not. And there are studies in social psychology that show that. Social psychologists have given certain explanations about these patterns. And going back to work by Kelly from 1973, there is certain perception that you're more credible when you're an in-group member because you're speaking against interests. Me saying something negative about Greek people is sort of, I'm hurting myself. So that has to be taken into account. Whereas somebody else says the same thing, that is not cool, that's not okay. Also, Brewer has shown that criticism of the in-group is also perceived by third-party members as an effort to help the in-group. I'm being critical and I'm saying bad things about you because I love you and I want you to be better because I'm a member of the community. So based on this work on moral licensing and the broader world work in social identity theory, I hypothesized that relative to a race-neutral candidate, a white race-neutral candidate, that race alone should not matter, or should matter to a very small degree, that we should see white voters punishing a white who derogates the out-group, so because that is an expression of racism and we recognize that. And given Berinsky's work, that a minority candidate who derogates the group may be punished a lot or may not be punished and they may be rewarded for their candor. And that an anti-PC prompt should increase support for a white derogator by providing moral license, that this is a mechanism that allows white people to sort of overcome, create a sort of race-neutral device to overcome the barriers of racial egalitarianism. So there are a couple of experiments. The first experiment, they're very similar. It's a fully crossed 3x3 design with a neutral candidate, a derogator, a black derogator, and a Latino derogator. So first, so it was done in MTurk with about 800 respondents in last year, in March of 2016. And I'm looking at dependent variables. The ones that are really interesting are intent to vote and agreement with a statement. I have the other ones, a competence and a thermometer. But I've only, for the most part, I'm using the vote and agreement ones. And this is what the primes looked like. Essentially, this is the derogatory prime. Many blacks get involved with crime, especially drugs. Blacks have to stop being criminals. And the bland one, the neutral one, it's like, policy's good. We need more policy. The system needs to be reformed. We need a system that works. Basically, really not giving people anything to say no to. So what do I find? First, when it comes to the race of the candidate, does it matter? Apparently, the race of the candidate across the three neutral candidates makes no difference. There are no statistically different effects across basically people don't care if the candidate is black, white, or Latino, as long as they're very, very neutral in their statement, people are likely to like them equally. And I didn't find any conditional effects across these candidates. More interesting, does white racism pay dividends, which is what the studies that we already have about how people respond to racial prejudice from white candidates. And I find that it's a huge penalty that a candidate who is overtly racist against an out-group pays, and it doesn't matter whether it is an anti-black statement or the same statement against Latinos, white candidates are penalized across the board. People say that they don't agree with them and they're not gonna vote for them in large numbers when they are expressing strong, overt racist messaging. What about minority again? Actually, yes. So what about, I also have, this is from a second experiment or a set of replications where I looked across issues with very similar primes in terms of how they were described. So whether the prime was about immigration policy or about welfare, people recognized overt prejudice and they penalize it across the board in similar ways. So the findings replicate across the board. I also looked at interactions and whether partisanship makes any difference and racial resentment. On the left and the top is, this is the white neutral candidate compared to the white derogator of blacks. And at the bottom, the two bottom ones are against the Latinos. As we see, Republicans are significantly more likely to vote for a white derogator who derogates, doesn't matter who he derogates against. It's the same pattern with racial resentment. So partisanship and racial resentment behave in very, very similar ways when it comes to how you evaluate derogation by a white candidate against out groups. So what about the minorities? What about the Ben Carson and the Ted Cruz? This is an interesting sort of asymmetry that I found here. For the African American, it's pretty clear that whites assume that a black candidate who derogates blacks has license to do so. And they like that. So there is no statistically significant difference in how they evaluate the white neutral candidate and the black who derogates blacks. So they don't penalize him, but they don't reward him either. It doesn't increase relative to the white neutral, but certainly it is a huge benefit to, you become competitive. If you're African American who derogates, you become competitive against a very bland, neutral white candidate. For Latinos, though, it's interesting that there is a penalty. And to me, and I would welcome comments on this, it suggests that Latinos are evaluated more closely to whites by a white audience, that they're seen as differently on the hierarchy, the racial hierarchy of the United States, and they're penalized. And I found this in a couple of replications, so it's not a one-off thing. But I haven't really spent a lot of time working on that. So race of the candidate doesn't matter. The racism of a white candidate is punished significantly, but only by Democrats and those low in racial resentment. And the derogation of the in-group is not punished for blacks, but it is for Latinos. And it is rewarded by Republicans when offered by Latinos. There is no conditional effect for black in-group derogation by partisanship or racial resentment, which suggests that when Democrats, white Democrats, are exposed to a black candidate who is derogating the in-group, they're okay with that. They agree with the statement as much as Republicans do. Which is also a very interesting dynamic there. So I think I'll leave it at that in order to, is that right, Eric? We're good? Okay. So sorry, I'm not going to tell you about anti-PC at this point. Thank you very much. Do you want to come up here and join me for the question and answer? Okay.
So I will walk around if folks have questions for the speakers. I had a point of information for you, Alexandra. For the Latino candidate in your experiments, he was given a Latino name?
Yes, absolutely, okay. Yes.
So questions from the audience for and either of the speakers? Yes.
Hi, Mara. I wondered if one of the mechanisms behind your results was that people had external knowledge of the Democratic Party and its relationship with Latinos, and part of the reason they were willing to move, or part of the reason why they moved, was because people believed believed the ads based upon this prior knowledge. So I wonder if you were to turn the experiment around and have Republicans trying to court Latinos, if you would get the same effect, because I wondered if people might not really believe the rapprochement toward Latinos.
Yeah, that's a really good question and one that's been brought up before. I think it'd be really interesting, although at this point I think it has less external validity. But I think it would absolutely be something that would be interesting to explore further. And I can't say anything more factual other than I agree that that would be interesting. to consider.
Yep, Vince.
So I had a question for Alexandra's presentation. It went by a little quickly, so I may have missed this, but it seems as if you were comparing a kind of a, for lack of a better word, a kind of a white bread candidate with a nondescript platform to a candidate who's making racially conservative or even potentially racially derogatory comments. Is that right? So I was wondering if you looked at, because you mentioned a series of replications as well, if you looked at a candidate, black, Latino, or white, who might be offering racially liberal policies.
Yes, and I haven't analyzed the data on that. I like very quickly look at it. I didn't see anything, and I actually even tried it with anti-white statements, but I didn't see much there either, but it's early.
I had a question for Mara. I'm trying to get it all straight here. And this is similar to the question you just received, but I'm wondering if reverse targeting, right, so the reverse message might work. This is right. What do you imagine would happen if you ran this with, say, a Republican or Trump and they had the threatening message, right? So it's the opposite message of, instead of trying to court, it's the messages he actually played during the election, right? So it's the same kind of process working in terms of how that affects people's partisanship or partisan identity or partisan, right? So instead of the Democratic Party trying to recruit, I might not be being clear enough, but that is, you're getting the push that we see in Alexandra's experiments, right? The push away by the Republicans.
Right, so if a Republican, like basically what happens when Trump says something really explicitly racist,
Right.
Does it increase, I don't know, does it increase the degree to which whites perceive the Republican Party as representing people like them?
I'm thinking about the Democrats still, right? Is still going to do this for the Democrats, right? That
so
is.
if the Democrats said something explicitly racist, would it increase the degree to which white Democrats felt like the party represented people like them? Kinda, no.
So, yeah, I'm not being clear. Would this affect Democratic voters in a similar way, right? So that if the Republican candidate were, instead of kind of pushing them away, the Republican candidate is kind of still activating these threats, right? If you would see the same kind of Democratic shift.
Wait, so
We may have to save this. I don't know if I'm being, I may be
Wait,
just
but I
like
want
getting
to
myself.
so if the Republican candidate said something, or the Democratic candidate said something explicitly racist.
Republican candidate, yeah.
If Donald Trump does what Donald Trump does.
Right, if just Donald Trump was being himself, yes. What are the, is that going to still activate the same kind of, and is that helping the partisan realignment that you're positing here from Democrats, right? Moving Democrats, is it moving Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, and it kind of gets at the effect of, like, I think what's really driving this is that many white Democrats are feeling like they're excluded, and the exclusionary dynamic is a different dynamic from feeling like you might be more able to be included in a group. So I think it would be really interesting. There's so many different elements, and I think the point that was also raised, that you also raised before, there's so many dynamics on it. Because even when you were saying, like, where would more racially conservative people move if the Republican Party was doing more outreach? There's just a lot of interesting dynamics that don't necessarily cleanly replicate what we're seeing, but I definitely think it's worth thinking about more.
Okay. Maybe I'll get it clear by the time we get to the bar. So.
Oh, that'll help.
Yeah.
Hey, so I have one small question just for Mara, and then a sort of larger question for both of you. So for small question, I was curious with the experiment with the ads, like the English and the Spanish ad, did you ask your respondents if they were aware that it was in Spanish?
Yeah.
Okay, so
The manipulation check, yeah.
okay, and they were aware.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, maybe they sort of heard it as a language that they didn't understand,
No,
and
that's a really good point. So I asked them, in that one, which, did you notice what language it was in? But before that, I also asked them in both ones, so who do you think this ad was targeting? And then the same thing with the Hillary one, who do you think she was targeting, just as a manipulation check?
Okay, thank you. And then sort of the broader question, and someone brought up a similar question last night, is, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like in all of your sort of research, all of the respondents were white, were non-Latino white. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how some of your work might apply similarly or differently to Black, Latino, folks of other races and their political attitudes.
Well, I think my stuff might be a little bit different because we know that explicit appeals to Latinos tend to, for a lot of Latino subgroups, tend to increase their likelihood of political participation and often of supporting that candidate. So I think the part I was looking at is one of the rare instances where white people hadn't really been looked at. And also, as always, just a more affordable research opportunity.
I don't know. I know that from other research, I know that Latinos respond or are motivated by very similar things, especially their policy attitudes, as whites. They sort of mirror whites in many attitudes. So it is possible, obviously, if a candidate is offering an anti-Latino statement, clearly that's not going to be particularly persuasive. An anti-Black statement actually may be quite persuasive and agreeable to them. So probably you'd see the difference in how they respond to, there would be a complete asymmetry because here I don't have like somebody offering an anti-white statement. But with the Latinos, that in the actual environment, social environment, that option exists, that an anti-Latino statement does exist.
But I'll say the other point, sorry, now that I'm thinking about more, is that we don't know at all how like appeals to Latinos affect how like Asian Americans think, and that's a really interesting point to raise, or African Americans or other subgroups. And there's stuff that we could draw from to explore that, but that's a good question.
And the language issue could affect African Americans too, because it's the cultural exclusion there.
Yeah.
It could activate threat there as well.
Right, yeah.
Yes.
So I had just two quick questions. One for you, Alexandra. I wasn't sure when you were explaining it. I think I may have gotten lost for a second. But was it the case that the Black like in-group derogation condition they were just not punished relative to the Black race-neutral condition, or that they outperformed?
Either. No, it wasn't punished relative to the Black or relative to the white neutral. The data that I presented, in order to be consistent, not too confusing, it's always compared to the white neutral candidate. But even compared to the white neutral candidate, there was no punishment. There wasn't an extra reward, but there was no punishment.
And quickly for Mara, I'm curious why, or kind of your reasoning for why the kind of the shift you saw was not driven by racial resentment. Do you think this was something that maybe because that's picking up some like specifically attitudes towards African Americans, or is there something else there?
I changed the questions. Maybe I shouldn't just change it. So there's a typical racial resentment scale that has questions about African Americans. So where it said African Americans, I changed it to Latinos, and maybe that's a flaw on my part. Maybe we shouldn't just assume that it would apply. But there isn't a racial resentment scale that I know of for Latinos that's not about like immigration only.
And Pettigrew has used it for immigrants,
Right.
so
all the stuff
it works.
is like about immigrants, but that's even different. So, and I know there's people in the department who are interested in developing a scale to look at racial resentment towards the Latinos. So maybe that's a flaw. Or I still think that a lot of we're all, I don't know, maybe just because we're in this world of everyone studying racial attitudes and we're all doing online survey experiments, I always wonder if people have seen these questions so many times before that it's not like, moving as much as it might otherwise would if it was a fresher question, but.
Hakeem.
Yeah, so my question's for Alexandria. I was really puzzled and interested in this bit about the no conditional effects. Because one of the things, and I wonder whether you cued partisanship about the candidates in the experiment.
No, I didn't.
Because the Ben Carson example, right, that was used to motivate it, we'll all recall how people responded to Ben Carson's statements. And it seems that there was some of that sort of partisan difference, but that's sort of anecdotal. So I was wondering about the partisan cue in the experiment and how that might shift responses.
There isn't a partisan cue, but I asked them at the end of the experiment as an attention check, sort of. Like, basically, it was a real DV, but hidden as an attention. I was like, attention check. What was the partisanship of the person mentioned in the experiment? And I never mentioned partisanship in the actual thing. So for the neutral candidates, you see that race cues Democratic, which makes sense. You know, that is totally, absolutely making sense. For the white, it is absolutely half. There's no difference. People are like guessing, throwing a coin, basically. For the black and the Latino, the minute that you see a black candidate or a Latino candidate who says essentially nothing, you get, they're Democrats. They have to be Democrats. For the white racist, immediately it cues Republican. So the white neutral is half and half, immediately 77% in the anti-black and 82% in the anti-Latino category, they say he's Republican. Here's what happens with the black candidates. It also cues Republican. Interestingly, I also asked them about ideology. You know, do you know what the ideology of the person was? It doesn't cue. Racial statements do not cue ideology. Oops, is this the right one? Yeah. Racial statement cue, sorry, the race doesn't cue ideology, racial statements do cue ideology. That's what I meant. Sorry, so it cues conservatism, but race itself doesn't cue conservatism, racial statements do cue conservatism.
And so I guess just a quick follow-up, I think this is a really important point because when we often use these neutral conditions, they're not actually, you know, neutral, right? And so in the case of the black neutral candidate, for the respondents, it's not actually a black neutral candidate, right? It's a Democratic candidate.
Clearly.
And so that's just one point to, I think, remember for all of us is that these neutral categories are not always neutral categories.
Absolutely, yeah, no, I agree, and that's what this suggests, absolutely. But nothing more I can do about that part.
It's funny for people who we study this stuff, right? And we know how race tracks to ideology and tracks to partisanship. And one of the things that the reason that we're focusing on experiments this session is because experiments allow us to, I mean, for decades we were fighting over whether people's prejudices were part of it was actually ideology and it was conservatism, and with experiments we've actually have tons and tons and tons of evidence that that's just not true, right? This is just racism, and it's being placed upon people. Understand which party represents which ideas, right? And they can sort them out, and we see further evidence of that here with these kind of simple statements. Other questions, comments? Yes.
For either of you, I just had a question, thank you, about if you controlled for or asked about urbanicity or exposure for your respondents, like how often these particular respondents came in contact with Black people or Latinos on a regular basis, if they would consider that part of their group or not in some ways. And then also for Mara, if you asked if they knew Spanish or had ever taken Spanish, like if that was they would be able to understand in either language, those candidates, just to see what that might have done. Just interested.
You'd hope the randomization takes care of something like that. and random assignment would, there's no reason to expect that they wouldn't be in equal numbers. But I don't know, because I don't collect information from this in terms of where they are. Also, these are not nationally representative samples. These are MTurks, which actually means that they're probably underrepresenting the effects rather than really a full representation of how strong the effects are. So I don't
What
know.
is the, for folks in the room, the kind of ideological or partisan kind of makeup of MTurk users in general? It's, I mean, I know it leans left.
It skews left,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
Substantially left and very young.
Yes, young, much
Yeah.
younger, and that's the big issue. You don't have anybody who's over 65. In this
Yeah.
sample, there's no one who's over 65.
So to your point, really kind of muting a lot of the effects.
Exactly.
Even
lot,
though the
these
effects
effects are
pretty
much larger,
Right.
most likely in the general population, in the real general population.
Or did you have a thought or response or?
No, I mean, I'm not sure, I would agree that hopefully the randomization accounts for any effect that things like urbanicity might play, but I think that the broader question is this related? Is exposure to these subgroups or populations related to how people react to these incidental encounters? And there is some really cool stuff that I was hoping to build on, showing that it did, and it was the past work has showed that like as the Latino population in certain neighborhoods grow, you see whites shift to like the Republican Party, and so because that was correlational, I was hoping to build on that with this.
So these projects complement each other so well. I'm thinking about ways of synthesizing, such as, I don't know, what happens if a Latino candidate woos Latino voters instead of undecided voters? Or what happens if a Latino or a black candidate trashes white people?
I actually have the data on that. I just haven't looked at them. Part of it is like I did the experiment. I don't know if it's believable. I mean, it might be believable. I was kind of like, sort of like trying to use the same, because I put it as part of the same experiment. So I'm afraid that I might have to do a different one, because to say that white people are criminals, I don't know that white people would buy into that. That's a believable line. I don't know. Haven't looked at it yet.
It has been said.
To see who would, hey.
We'll take a couple more and then we'll leave some time for folks to talk to the speakers directly.
For clarification, on the slide that's here, and you may have said this already, so apologies if you did. It looks to me that people perceive in general a black candidate is much more likely to be Democratic than a white candidate, but no more likely to be conservative or liberal than a white candidate.
Correct.
Which kind of connects to what Mara, I think, was talking about, with people becoming maybe more tribal in their voting patterns, but not necessarily shifting ideology. In other words, is it that people say, well, you know, white people may be leaving the Democratic Party, becoming Republican, but they're not necessarily becoming more conservative, however you define that?
Layman and in policy related, I mean, isn't that sort of, it goes both ways, right? Layman and Carsey would say that, you know, you move to the party and adopt the party's ideology, or you move based on your preferences to the party that, so it's sort of an endogenous relationship and it goes in both ways.
Here it looks like the person would say that a neutral black candidate, if I remember the statistics correctly, is something like, what, 75% likely to be Democratic,
And
but 50% likely to be conservative.
Yes, right. So they don't, partisanship, ideology just doesn't cue, I guess, the same thing. It doesn't cue like identity or like,
Right, so you're perceiving that in some way a black conservative is still more likely to be Democrat.
They could be thinking about the various religious policies that the person holds, that the balance is
Right, they could be saying the person is pro-life or the person is whatever, but still likely to be Democrat. Yeah.
Yeah, somehow, even though clearly they think he's a Democrat, they can't assign clearly an ideology that goes with that for a black
Yeah.
person.
That's really interesting.
Thanks. Are there any other questions? Okay, I know from past
Yeah.
experience, many of you have more questions, and you can now ask them to the speakers directly, but first, let's thank them for their time. Thank you for your time.